build. And what's ironic is, when I left the State Department after more time in some pretty tough neighborhoods, I, at that point, didn't think that the skills I gained in a war zone would be applicable in our own country, which is really to try and bring people together and to find common ground. I think one of the biggest reasons why I'm running to take on Chris Stewart and Donald Trump indirectly is I believe our country, our district, and our state cannot begin to rebuild and repair until we close this chapter on Donald Trump. And Chris Stewart has been a big facilitator of everything that he stands for. I could talk a bit about the two key themes and maybe the two key issues that we led off with, but I also usually like to preface what I say, which is I still consider myself to be a writer more than anything. So just don't listen to what I say, whether it's tonight or whether it's some of the other interviews I've done. I've done a lot of podcasts and interviews, and I think they're important. But I always encourage people to read what I've written, because I believe writing is important. I believe when you own your words on paper, it's part of an archive that not enough, I think, of our current elected leaders think about, and that includes legislation. If you're going to legislate, is it ambiguous for a reason, or is it actually treated in a way I think that lawmaking should be? So maybe in the minute I've got left as far as an introduction, when I announced last December I was teaching and almost had another book deal done with my editor, but I knew that 2020 was going to be a very important year, given that it was a referendum, I believe, on Donald Trump and Trumpism, and a facilitator, I call him a collaborator like Chris Stewart. And I'm pretty blunt. I don't shy away from why I'm running. I think this was never going to be a safe campaign because this year the stakes are too high. When COVID hit, I think it took on an even deeper dimension, which is a healthcare system that was already broken. What that pandemic has shown is how big the pieces are. And now the question is, how do we put them back together? I'm on the individual market in the ACA because when I left my cushy government job, I never worried about healthcare. But when I became a teacher and a writer, which isn't the highest paying career in the book, luckily Obamacare was there. And so for the last decade, Select Health sends me a letter every fall. So I think I can relate to a lot of people in the district who don't quite know what's going to happen next. But the two key themes were themes I think that still hold. And this was in a Salt Lake Tribune piece I wrote last December, and it was being better neighbors. And I think in a district as diverse and as big as CD2, urban and rural, west side, east side, farmers, ranchers, environmentalists, people who live in skyscrapers, but also people who live on a farm, that we need to make an effort to try and understand where common issues are. So I've put about 6,000 miles on my old truck to go to places that are hard to go. We've got a map that we share with people. We show all the red dots, and it goes from Callio down to Washington County, Big Water, through the national parks, all the way up to Farmington and Davis County, and of course, Salt Lake City. So being better neighbors, I think, takes a choice, and I think it takes a commitment. And now I think it's in because of COVID, but I believe that before. And of course, I think Donald Trump is everything not that. I think he's been trying to divide us ever since he got elected, and that's caused a lot of damage in our neighborhoods and in our communities. The second issue is country over party. Of course, that's pretty straightforward, given that my old job was to represent our country, and now I'm seeking to represent a district of 700,000 people. So I fundamentally believe why I want to go to Congress is to, again, get the professionalism back in government, get the seriousness back. Two key issues that I led off with, which I'll speak briefly about: affordable, accessible healthcare. Until we get to for all, we're failing. It doesn't mean some, it doesn't mean many. How we get to for all is the debate, and I'm happy to talk about my own views about how we get there as soon as possible. And I think the biggest problem is in the Senate right now. And then the other issue is very much tied to seeing what war does to people. It can hurt and kill entire provinces, like I saw in Western Iraq. So people sometimes forget that members of Congress are also charged with voting for or against war. So there's a bill that was passed a few days after September 11th called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force. And I'm very focused on making sure that any president actually goes to the people through representatives before making a decision as serious as war. The logo of our campaign, and I'll end with this, is meaningful. It's this. It's not a handshake. It's two forearms together. And again, if there's anything I'm running on, is to try and try and get the poison behind us as much as we can to start the rebuilding and the repair work. And I really don't believe that's possible if Chris Stewart is reelected or if Donald Trump is reelected.
Well, thank you. And certainly there's a lot for us to cover tonight. I really appreciate you laying out the issues. My next question is, was there a specific moment that you decided to take the plunge? Running for Congress, you said, in 2020 was never going to be an easy endeavor. And just wondering if there was a particular moment that made you decide to do it.
You know, that's a great question. I would say one of the moments was I had an uncle who, my mom's youngest brother, and he enlisted in the Army right out of high school and went to Vietnam and then returned after almost being killed in Vietnam with a second chest wound. And he returned to Beaver County, which is in CD2. It's in the district. And he passed away of emphysema. He was a smoker and a drinker and Jack Mormon and all that. And I went to his funeral in a little church in Beaver County. And I heard all these people stand up and talk about my uncle and what he had done after deciding to get involved at the county level. And when we moved his coffin from the church to the little cemetery there in Beaver, it was pretty powerful, because I think the easier thing to do is to sit out politics. And you know, you've lived this yourself, Turner. It's easy to sort of watch, but I think it's more important when you maybe have a biography and some experiences that lend itself to maybe making a strong case against someone like Chris Stewart. So that was one big moment. I think the other is as a friend of mine overseas finally told me not that long ago, is, Kael, the problem is you're in love with your country. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. I care too much about the state of our country and the state of our state and the state of our district, where I believe he has not earned the title of representative. And, you know, breaking up is always hard to do, but breaking up with your country is not something I was prepared to do. So I think, given the stakes of 2020, given, I think, the damage and division that we're living through, war taught me and war tested me in a way that I think I was ready to say, I'm going to do this, and I've got a lot of experience, I think, that's relevant. 10 or 15, 20 years ago, I don't think I would have been ready to have made this decision. But I think, like people who do run, it should be less about you and more about the people that are most vulnerable. And in that same Tribune piece, I think I wrote the statement that our politics are failing our people, particularly the most vulnerable among us. And I hear that all the time. You know, people may have a 3-month cushion and then rent can't be paid. And people may have a little bit of savings, but it's not a lot. And honestly, the people who I usually hear from, whether by email or by phone, or who donate, in my view, are not the people that are going to be affected most if our government continues to fail. And those are the people I remind our team that we're really fighting for, because we'll never hear from them. They're not able to Zoom to work. They're working hard every day, and $30 donation is too much. So I always try and keep that in mind.
Thank you. I'm going to do one more of my questions, and then we have a question from Aaron, who submitted one on the chat. But
great.
For those that are watching, that Congress might feel a little bit far away and far removed from their day-to-day lives. I'd like to ask you, in your opinion, what is the most important role that you can play as a congressman? And then why does your particular race matter to the average voter here in the 2nd District?
Yeah, I think that right now it's tied to what's going on with COVID. The relief that was agreed in a bipartisan way helped, but it was not enough help. So Congress is directly in charge right now of whether or not small businesses, whether there will be another moratorium on rent. Issues like, is the Affordable Care Act, which I'm on, as I mentioned, and maybe many of you are on, is that going to be strengthened, or is that going to be attacked and destroyed, as my opponent over 40 times has voted? So if you're worried about healthcare, as I am, it's Congress that's got to act. Including if the Supreme Court, which it looks like may take on the ACA in November. So that's, I think, a fundamental issue that affects literally tens of millions of Americans. The ACA brought in about 23 million people, but there's still tens of millions who aren't yet part of a healthcare system that still needs to be improved. What can I do? Honestly, I think my race represents the ultimate check on Donald Trump, because Chris Stewart has been a facilitator of Donald Trump from the very beginning. So I think there needs to be accountability. There needs to be a clear rejection of the politics of the last 4 years. And of every member of our congressional delegation, I believe Chris Stewart treats his job to be Donald Trump's representative to Utah and not our representative to Washington. One of the commitments I'll make to the question is, one of the things that being in Afghanistan and Iraq taught me is, I need to reach out to people who disagree with me. So I've met 3 times and done podcasts with Tooele libertarians. And I, again, am not running a safe campaign. I'm not a candidate who wants to be told, hey, these are the questions we think they're going to ask you. So it's a high risk thing. You're recorded and they can ask you anything you want. I've met with people whose politics are diametrically on paper opposite of mine. But for example, when I had a call unexpectedly with Ryan Bundy, who was part of the Oregon standoff, he had received a bulk text from us and said he wanted to talk to me. He was shot and wounded in Oregon, and the gentleman from Kanab was killed next to him. After a 2-hour conversation, I heard that actually there are some issues, criminal justice reform, that he and Black Lives Matter saw more alike than different. So one of those skills I bring, I think, is based on my former State Department career. But there are a host of other issues. Clean air and water, those are national priorities. Congressional legislation is always going to be important on that. I think the politicization of some of our agencies in Washington, whether it's the CDC or whether it's public health or land issues, those are things I think that affect us here in Utah and in the district. And I think I would know where to dig to make improvements.
Thank you. I think that perfectly sets up Aaron, the question from Aaron. Aaron asked, and I'm paraphrasing here, but how does, I'll just read the exact question. How much alike are the barriers of creating dialogue between different factions in Iraq and that of dialogues between Democrats and Republicans?
Aaron, that's a great question. I guess one of the biggest differences is that when the former insurgents in Fallujah or the former Taliban in eastern Afghanistan would come to the table, I was pretty sure they still didn't have their weapons, but sometimes we had to check. So at least right now, we don't have the kind of literal violence that a war zone creates. It's a very red cycle, and it's very hard to stop. And that's why I do think our country is walking close to an edge. Again, I don't want to be one of those people who pushes other people off or jumps off together. And we're not there yet. But I think we need to make a clear decision on November 3rd and between November 3rd and January 20th, that whatever common ground we can find, we need to really grab a hold of it. So, I founded Democrats Abroad Iraq. I was younger and we were sitting in Baghdad and, we wanted to get together as Democrats way back when. And so I've always believed that Democrats are more in line with what I believe. It's looking out for the common good. Sometimes I'm asked, what is good governing? And in my view, it's finding the public good, the common good. And I think we've lost sight of that. And I think we've lost sight of it because of the role in money in politics, which is usually the question when I'm asked, is there anything else you want to raise? And if it hasn't come up, I talk about how we need to get money out of politics. And that's really the number one issue I would love to work, is how to get it so that politicians or public servants are not worried about raising money and are not listening to people who have bought influence. And I think that is how we get to a point where Donald Trump can pay $750 in taxes and lose hundreds of millions of dollars. It's a symptom of how corrupt I think the system is. We need to probably make big changes, and that will, I think, require a constitutional amendment. But, I don't think Democrats and Republicans can agree on everything. But in Utah, one-party rule is not good for anyone. And that's another big reason why I'm running, is I'm not a Democrat who wants to feel sorry for himself because I'm in a gerrymandered district. If someone in rural Utah asks me about guns, I eventually want to get to, are you afraid of going bankrupt if your child or your family member has a pre-existing condition, or if you get unlucky and the hospital bill comes in? If I get asked about choice or abortion, which I do, that's fine. Every question is fair. But I want to also get to other issues like, are you concerned about water in Utah? Are you concerned about the inland port? Are you concerned about air pollution? So governing for me is about hiring someone who prepares for the next worst pandemic. Because guess what? The next pandemic may be 1 out of every 20 people who is killed. And my time in government always trained me before to think about, sometimes you only have bad options, and what's the least bad option. So I run toward challenges. I run toward trying to find common ground while standing on principle. And I think if you listen to people and you give them time, they'll tell you, what you really need to hear. The final point I'll make is that I'm not a Democrat running as I believe Chris Stewart runs. He, I believe, treats his district as really listening to Republicans only. If I win, my job's to represent a geographic space that includes over 700,000 people. So when I was down in Panguitch in Garfield County at the commission meeting, I told the commissioners that just because my great-great-grandfather from Denmark, who was an orphan, got shipped from Panguitch to Escalante, doesn't mean I'm smarter because my ancestors got here 150 years ago. If someone got to Utah or this district a week ago, I'm going to fight for them too. And no one should try and pull the, we got here first card, which is more of an issue down in rural Utah than in urban Utah. What I love about CD2 is that it's politically complicated. It's geographically beautiful, but politically complicated. So I'm a Democrat that wants to build our party in places like Richfield, in Beaver County, in Iron County, in Sevier, in other places that it's hard to go, because on issues, there's real common ground. But I'll tell you, the Iraqis and the Afghans, anything I've experienced in the campaign is not harder than what I experienced in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I do believe this is one of the most important things I'll ever do.
Thank you. I'm going to give you a break for just a second because I've asked a bunch of questions in rapid succession. And just remind folks that are watching live, if you have questions for Kael, please feel free to submit them, and we'll be sure to get to as many as we can. Another question has come in from Aaron, and he's asking about the wealth gap. He cites a Pew Research study on wages that show that wage growth hasn't kept up with inflation.
Yep.
And just rather than get into specifics, I'd just like to give you an opportunity to kind of talk about how you would create economic opportunity for everyone.
Great question. And in fact, I was just down in Kayenta in Washington County, which is a very high-end retirement community, and a Kentucky transplant kind of asked me a question which is similar in a different way, which is, how can we afford trillions of dollars in aid, right? And what I did with him, I'm going to do with you, which is hold up my hands. I used to say that in 1929, the gap in our country was huge in terms of income inequality. Well, we all know what happened after 1929. There was a Great Depression. It was unsustainable. That gap was a problem for a lot of people. And it was a fairness issue. It was a taxing issue. It was a private industry that was amok. And I say, before COVID hit in February of 2020 this year, the gap was almost as high as it was in 1929. So how can we address that? And I think COVID shifted that. And yet, if you look at the data, I was reading an article recently that if you're in the .com Silicon Bay Area, you've done really well over the last 6 months. Well, most Americans have not. And that's something where I think government has a legitimate right to come in, and where I usually like to start the debate, specifically to your question, is, hey, let's first start about the year one tax cut that Trump pushed through and that the Republicans supported. The price tag on that was $1.5 trillion. So sometimes when conservatives or Republicans ask me a question about we can't afford, or fiscal discipline, which is what Mr. Stewart likes to talk about, I like to say, well, it's about priorities and then where you find resources to address those priorities. So let's start with the $1.5 trillion tax cut, and where did it go? It ended up going to corporations. It ended up going to very, very high wealth, net worth people. people who don't need a tax cut. I've had donors say to me, I didn't need that tax cut because it missed out on, I think, the people where good policy should be focused, which is middle class and working class. So how do we acknowledge those facts and remember where we were before COVID, and then how do we address it? I think there's an argument to be made for looking again at that tax cut, for moving toward a more progressive take on where we get our revenue. And I think that Senator Warren had a good plan when she was running for president. I think that there are other people who have talked hard about what is a fair deal in our system. Again, Donald Trump pays $750 of taxes, it seems, legally, based on the loopholes that are built into that. How do we create jobs? It's, in my view, focusing first on the most vulnerable communities that are being hit hardest by this pandemic. And given the coalition you represent, my sister lived in Rose Park for 4 years. I got to know Rose Park pretty well when she lived there before I moved away. This pandemic has not hit all populations equally. It's hit working women and communities of color and minority populations a hell of a lot harder than it's hit people in 84108 or 84105. So I think government has a legitimate role of saying, how do we address some of those inequities first? Education, hugely important. There are populations that are underserved that aren't going to get ahead or get a fair shake unless the federal government incentivizes more equality. And I think we've seen some success with that with some of the federal programs. Those would be two places to start. And then I would say, in terms of education, I'm in favor of looking hard at community college, making it open to all, and looking at student loans or student grants that make it accessible. I graduated with just under $25,000 of debt 20 years ago. And that was a lot of money. And it took me a while. I had to go to Iraq before I paid it off. That was a lot of money. And I don't recommend going to a war to pay off your student loans, but that's basically what it took me. So I understand how we try and get a fair deal. And I think those are some areas where we could make some improvements.
Thank you. I think that's a pretty good segue to talk. When you were introducing yourself, and multiple times tonight, you've mentioned that you get your healthcare through the exchange. And I think that's probably pretty unique for a congressional candidate. And just wanted to ask what your overall experience has been with the exchange, and then maybe if that's a priority for you, how you would engage on healthcare when you're elected.
It is. And, honestly, it's been good overall. It went up quite a bit initially, and then it seems to have stabilized recently. I pay just under $500 a month with Select Health. I've used it for a bad tooth issue at one point, and I had a limited dental benefit. So it was half or more out of my pocket. But I pay it every month. I believe that I'm paying to help people who are worse off than I am. I've netted Select Health. I once roughly did the numbers, quite a bit of money in the last 10 years. But I believe that's, as still someone relatively young and healthy, that's what I believe in doing. So I'm glad there's still the option. And again, one of the big issues I would fight for is to protect the ACA. If there's one issue that's very different between me and the incumbent, is he has voted over 40 times to underfund, undercut, and destroy the Affordable Care Act. That's all on his website. It's all on his press releases, with no replacement plan. He's also, of course, quiet or supportive of the states, including our own, which are suing over the Affordable Care Act. That, to me, is unconscionable, particularly when millions of Americans and tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Utahns have lost their health insurance because they lost their job through COVID. So that's the status quo. We've still got people who are not part of the ACA. How do we get to for all? Sometimes I think we forget when, people want us to stand and salute the flag and say the Pledge of Allegiance, which is great, what those words mean. One nation indivisible, are we? I think we're being tested right now, particularly by a president that wants to divide us, and with liberty and justice for all. Until we get to for all on justice and healthcare being, in my view, the fundamental gap in our system right now, it's a failing. I support expanding the ACA. I support more transparency. I support looking at prescription drug prices, giving people an option through the government. That will create more competition. I do not favor right now saying we're going to turn this over to single payer overnight. Why? I think we'll get there, and I think that's the right goal in terms of moving toward for all. But I think when 1 out of 10 jobs is tied more or less to the current healthcare status quo, tens of millions of Americans are going to hear that and be like, hey, that's too much too soon. But I do think by looking at a public option, maybe reducing the age of Medicare, that's another interesting notion. So you drop that. Making billing more transparent, I think the federal government with a public option would have a huge amount of leverage. And I'll end with a final point on the healthcare question, which is, as someone who represented our country with the State Department, I like to spin the globe and say, hey, which countries seem to be doing it innovatively or even better than we are? And when the UN comes out with its annual happiness index, happiness is often tied to your health. And those countries that rank themselves as the happiest in the country, and people generally don't lie if you're happy or sad, I think, tend to be the countries that have healthcare where it's considered that you won't go bankrupt, that it's basically a safety net that's real. It's not two strings thick. And we can cite the part of the world where that's more likely true than not, and that's the Nordic countries. So I think there's something to be learned about a different kind of safety net. And I think more and more Americans are open to that. And healthcare's got to be the place where we start first.
Thank you. I'd like to circle back to something that you mentioned earlier, which is just the expanse of your district, that it's a very large district, very diverse district, and just kind of wondering what kind of strategies you'd employ to, as you say, represent everyone in the district.
Yeah, we've been doing it by the amount of tire tread that I've worn out on my 17-year-old truck. So we've put in about 6,000 miles since convention, and we were even traveling before COVID and before convention. And in my view, that's political due diligence. So I'm starting to build relationships and understand issues because we've been in these rural counties and we've been in Davis County, and I've reached out to people like the LDS Church, to say, hey, what are the issues that are important to you, because they're in the middle of the district. We meet with different groups who have different priorities. But I am committed to saying that, if I win, I'll go to the county that voted the most against me and say, okay, you didn't like me, but I'm here. I want to represent you. Let's start the conversation. And that's why I've been to 2 county commission meetings, Beaver County and Garfield County. These are Republican areas, but I'm listening in order to understand. And then I think one of the things that I've learned, and really my former job taught me this, is that, not all ranchers are the same. Ranchers understand when the water levels are going down in the aquifer. Not all environmentalists are the same. So there's a lot of diversity within labels, and you've got to really listen and get to know people in order to do that. Is it a challenge? Will it be a challenge? Absolutely. But I actually think that the model of CD2 is where our country might be able to start to come together, which is to say the Republicans gerrymandered it, but guess what? On issues, we're finding common ground. 2 that I'll highlight. My dad is a downwinder. He got his cancer diagnosis last fall. He got his letter from the Department of Justice in June. He got his $50,000 tax-free check. Didn't take away the cancer. He's doing okay now. But that's a bridging issue. Nuclear testing, Congressman McAdams is focused on that. It's a good issue. It's an important issue. Another is protecting post offices and protecting the legitimacy of the mail-in ballot. We've gone to 30 different little post offices throughout CD2, and I've pulled out my iPhone and taken photos of those post offices. And then we put a post office ad on Sean Hannity. And I'm no fan of Sean Hannity, but I know that if people listen to Sean Hannity and hear that there's a candidate who's aware of the concern about post offices shutting down, that's another bridging issue. Same thing with water. I was pretty vocal on that. I thought the St. George pipeline was not wise, that we should start with conservation first. And when 6 states said, hey, hold your horses, Utah, Mother Nature, in my view, has called the bluff. So I'm glad that that's on hold right now. But it's half the state almost geographically. But if I were Turner, if I were a Democrat only running in Salt Lake City, guess what? I'd be nodding my head up and down with a lot of other people, and that would not be good for me, would not be good for our party. We need to go and make the case in a lot of places where it's hard to make the case, and then you build the relationships, and then you meet the county commissioners who are willing to work toward compromise and solutions.
Thank you.
It's burn and tire tread, and it's cost me about $1,100 or $1,200 in truck repairs, because if you've never been out to Callio, it's about 20 ranching families, not that far below Wendover, but it's a pretty bumpy commute between there and Delta. But it's worth doing, because you realize there's more in common than divides us, and that's really what I think our best leaders try and focus on. And I think that's what Senator Harris will be talking about tonight. And I know that Joe Biden has also said he's going to be a president for all people in our country. And I think we're tired. We need to get back to that as soon as we can.
Thank you. We received 2 more questions. The first one related specifically to public education and or around charters and vouchers, which I don't know is super topical. So what I'll do is broaden that question a little bit to ask specifically, or less specifically, I should say, just general thoughts on public education. And you mentioned community colleges earlier, just wondering if you'd like to expand on that.
Yep. Well, my mom was a 6th grade school teacher for 3 decades, so this one hits home. I'm also old enough to remember when teachers went on strike for the right reasons, and it translated into some real improvements. I think what COVID has shown in terms of public education is when it's in to talk about people that we need, but we don't think about it until the crisis hits, something's wrong with that. I think that this amendment on the ballot is probably going to hopefully be voted down. I think it's going to put at risk some of the funds that the income tax should be going toward as it has been. I think that, again, what COVID has shown is there are some school districts that are going to always hurt more than others. And so vouchers, for me, when the vouchers thing took off, I was overseas, and I kept on thinking, as the son of a public school teacher, I just don't quite get how this model is really going to work, because it seems like it has built-in inequities and built-in unfairness to it. And I think if you look back, I think that's proven to be the case. So I hope that the funding issue, and we're the lowest in the country, and we've been there pretty much for too long, we can reinvest and not take away money when it's most needed. And that's where, again, running for Congress, I think I've got a legitimate case to make. I am in favor of federal funds that can close the gap with state and local budgets. If you look at what the revenue drop has been, I heard it in, Garfield County. When tourists don't show up because of COVID in Garfield County, those motels are not producing tax revenue. You see it in other places. If we're laying off firefighters, teachers, others who we depend on for the services that make our communities work, I'm in favor of what Speaker Pelosi, and at least in the House, are trying to push forward, which is additional revenue to close those gaps. So that's kind of the immediate need. The other thing I would say is that in the rural areas of CD2, public education is still suffering from a bandwidth gap, an internet gap. And we saw that when COVID hit, and I'd hear from teachers and other people in education, including at the college in Cedar City, but especially in the secondary and the elementary schools, about, hey, they say we're going to get our Chromebook, but what about the connectivity issue? That also ties to that once kids graduate, maybe there are jobs that will allow them to stay in the rural areas if they choose there, and can get into those careers through the internet, or people who are relocating to Utah because they're tired of city life in LA or Vegas or Phoenix, and they want to telecommute from Wayne County or Iron County or Washington County. And I have conversations along the campaign trail with people who are in that category as well.
Thank you.
And then I guess the final point I'd make is there are some good candidates, including where you are, Deborah Gatrell, Liz Waite. I believe governing only really succeeds when we get people in government who have lived experiences. So I can't wait till we get more teachers into government. Deborah's running for county council. Liz has been a very powerful and effective and influential member in the state legislature. I know Karina, who's running with Chris Peterson, has a lot of good experience on educational issues. So I joke sometimes, but I mean it. We don't need more old white guys in government. I'm a middle-aged or approaching middle-aged white guy. We need people who have lived experiences, because then policy will flow from that.
Thank you. To follow up on your comment about supporting debt relief or I should say budget relief for state and local government, Senator Romney today tweeted that he was looking at a plan that would potentially allow states to borrow with a federal guarantee. Is that something you'd be interested in? Or
yeah, that's very interesting. I hadn't read that. Thanks for during the debate, I'll Google it, because that's an interesting concept of allowing states to sort of take the responsibility to be insured with a federal guarantee. I like it. I think Senator Romney has been thinking innovatively with this COVID pandemic, much more than the other members of our delegation. And politics shouldn't be about me just reading the political rap sheet of Chris Stewart. It's long and it's real, and we should all know about it. But I think politics at its best is about how do we improve the lives of people? How do we build something better? How do we start the repair work? So it's been interesting listening and watching Senator Romney on a number of these issues, because I think he's proven to be more innovative and problem-solving oriented and pragmatic. So I like the concept. I'd have to look at it. I think it's a lot better than just saying, good luck, you're on your own.
Thank you. The next question comes from an audience member, and Mohammed asks, just given your experience in Afghanistan and Iraq, how you would view those issues, I shouldn't say issues, view our relationship with those countries if you were elected to Congress?
Well, Mohammed, thank you for the very personal and meaningful question. And I could, if you want to reach out to me, I'll send you my book. I'll mail it to you directly from me. But it's an important question, because another reason why I'm running is the repair work and the rebuilding we need to do around the world. I had a lot of Iraqi and Afghan friends killed and hurt in these wars. And so for me, I'm nearsighted. I care too much about the people over there to say, hey, good luck, you're on your own. So sometimes I've been interviewed by NPR and some of the national media, and I say, hey, let me confess up front. When you've done 7 years in 2 wars and you got to know a lot of the people on the ground, you're not going to be Mr. Objective foreign policy guy. You're going to think about the schools we built in Eastern Afghanistan where young girls would go to school. Half of those schools were probably destroyed, but the other half are still functioning. So I fundamentally believe that the United States is at our strongest when we lead by our values. And we've lost sight of that under Donald Trump. When the dreams of the world are with us, we're at our strongest. And that's another reason why I'm running, is we need to get our country back to respecting our allies, to listening more than lecturing, to not denigrating people, whether at home or overseas, because we can. There has been a huge scar, I think, on our country that can be defined as talking about walls and not bridges. It's like, let's draw the bridge up, stay away. That can be issues like visas and immigration, which we could talk about. I'm focused on the TPS program, the Temporary Protected Status program. I've got a good friend from Honduras whose grandmother cleans Dodger Stadium, and she's on the TPS program. So I know viscerally and firsthand what that means when that's up in the air. For dreamers, I'm for a pathway to citizenship. But when it comes to the wars, I want us never to start a war we don't have to start. But once we build a relationship with the people on the ground, I'm a very big believer that abandoning those relationships is not in anyone's interest, and a little effort on our part can go a long way. So, Mohammed, I'm happy to send you my book. Just email me directly, kael@westonforcongress.com, or you can reach out to our campaign and say that, I asked you to reach out to me, or share it on chat or whatever function you've got. That's true for anyone. Reach out to me directly. I'm very transparent. But that question's a very important one, because I'm also running to fix our foreign policy. There are big problems with how we have not focused on the values, I think, that make us a great country. We have treated the world in a transactional way. And Donald Trump is responsible for that, and he needs to be fired. And he needs to be fired in a big way.
Thank you.
Yep.
I'm going to wind down for the last three questions that I have for you tonight. And the next one I'd like to give you is, I know we've talked about a lot of issues tonight, and I know there's so many that we could talk about. I'd like to give you just an opportunity to really frame what your race is about and why voters should select you and elect you to Congress from the 2nd District.
Yeah, I'll repeat. It's a referendum on two people, Donald Trump and Trumpism, and everyone around Donald Trump who has facilitated Trumpism. And Chris Stewart is number one in that. If I thought he was acting as a representative and was doing a good job, I wouldn't be running. It's a very clear choice. We're not differences by a few points. It's 100% difference between me and him. And I think the Affordable Care Act and healthcare is the number one issue where we're different. He's attacked it. He's tried to destroy it. I'm fighting for it, and I'm on it. I'm not speaking theoretically. The other point, COVID. I'm running to make sure what Iraq taught me. When bad government, bad governing, bad policy making happens, people can die. That was true in Iraq, and it's true in COVID. I've got a brother and two nephews that have COVID. So it's personal, but it's personal to a lot of us. Bad government, bad governing, incompetent governing can get us killed. That's why I'm running, to make sure it never happens again. Those would be places to start. I would also say, in addition, I'm running to bring us together. I'm diplomatic by nature. I'm a bridge builder by nature. And I think that what we're missing in our state is a healthy two-party system. Utah was better when it was purple. Anytime one party makes all the decisions, it's bad for everyone. It's including bad for the Republicans. They get moved too far right. There's not a conversation. There's not a debate. And we see that with the ballot propositions. You know, I trust the people. One of the big things that I think is different with me and why I'm running is I trust the people. That's why I go to places where there aren't a lot of Democrats, because I trust that, you know, the people, when you get to know them and talk to them, they'll tell you what you need to hear. I think that, you know, it gets back to, you know, when I mentioned, you know, the division in our country. I don't want our country to be further divided. Congress has a key role in trying to check the presidency, to pass laws that are fair, to pass laws that protect us, that don't undercut different communities because of some argument that some part of our government's making. Again, governing at its best is about the public good. Governing at its worst is, I think, what we've been experiencing for the last 4 years. And Chris Stewart and Donald Trump need to be held accountable. And I'm very blunt. I'm not like other people running this year. I'm saying it's about Trumpism, Donald Trump, and people like Chris Stewart who looked the other way when the courts were attacked, when the media was attacked, when conventions in our Constitution were attacked, like whether or not an election should be delayed or whether or not an election will be trusted as the will of the people. I mean, these are big things that I'm running on, I think, now, which are different given, I think, the gravity of where we are between now and November 3rd. But I am hopeful. I think that a majority of our state, our district, and our country want to see more common ground, want to come together. And that may be 60% of our country, it may be 65% of our country, but it's a majority of our country. And so that makes me hopeful. Finally, if there's one issue that I would, again, like to really work on, it's public financing of campaigns. It's getting money out of politics. I have to raise money to do this, but when someone told me, who was an insider, that I needed to raise $1 million to run for Congress, I said, you got to be kidding me. I don't want to reinforce a broken model. So we've worked hard to do what we need to do. And if any of you have the means, yeah, we'll welcome support. But it's not just money. It's phoning, it's texting, it's getting word out among your friends. Because if we can get money out of the system, we'll see more teachers run for office. We'll see more people who have a day job run for office. That's when I think we're going to finally get the government we need.
Thank you. The second to last question I have for you is, how can people contact you? Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, please do. I'm very accessible. I got a call from someone left me a voicemail out of the blue. They found my number, and I called him back. And for 5 minutes, he thought I was Chris Stewart, which was funny. But I'm very accessible. It's Kael at westonforcongress.com. That's my direct email. So it's just my first name. And then our website is Weston, Weston, for Congress.com. We're on all the social media platforms, including Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram.
Thank you. The last question I have for you, I know we talked a lot about different things tonight, but is there anything that I didn't bring up that I should have?
Only related to that issue of money and public financing, which is, I was at this Senator Harris gathering before the debate, and we had yard signs, and it was a lot of excitement, and people gathered, before the debate, which many of us will probably watch in 8 minutes. But I would say to people that, we need to keep in mind the people who never asked for a yard sign, because not only they don't have a yard, they don't have a home. And I think what CD2 has taught me is there's a lot of hurt, there's a lot of pain, there's a lot of people who need someone in government who realizes that if this COVID relief package doesn't go through, people are going to be booted out of their apartments. If servers at restaurants continue to lose their jobs because the restaurants are shutting down, that's on us. So I always think about people who are going to be most affected by failed policy, and guess what? They are the most vulnerable. And COVID has really shown that. COVID has shown that safety net is a lot better for some people and non-existent for others. And what I think most people want in terms of the relationship between us and our government is a fair deal. And that's what we need to work toward, starting with healthcare. We could talk about other issues, but I think healthcare for all, peace of mind, no bankruptcies is a very important place to start. And then I think we just got to close this chapter of poisonous politics and destructiveness that Donald Trump represents.
Well, thank you. I really appreciated our time tonight, and I know that we could talk for until we're
we could.
Thank you for your time, and good luck in November.
Well, thank you, Turner, and all of you who participated tonight. Again, please reach out to our campaign. Before COVID hit, we were talking about opening up our field office where you all are. And since I know Rose Park pretty well, but of course that changed things, and we've been all, scattered about. But I know you're all doing a lot of important work. We didn't have a chance to talk about the inland port, and I don't believe it's just a state or a local issue. We could have talked about that. But if you want to have me back on, I'm happy to do it before election. If I win, we'll definitely do it, because I could learn a lot from the issues you've been working yourself and a lot of people I'm sure that were on the session tonight. So thank you for your time, and thank you all for being involved. That's the only way we get change.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and good luck in November.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Take care.
See ya.
All right.